with the live stream. Okay. Sorry, I'm muttering a little bit to myself. Sometimes when you wake up and it's, somewhat cloudy out and things, it's like, okay, come on, brain, start working.
It makes you a little foggy, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's going. And I can see any potential chats if those come in. All right. Well, let's get started. And first, I'm going to ask if there's any prayer requests.
Oh, just again for the people in Afghanistan. That is just so sad, and I just don't think there's a right answer in there.
Yeah,
it's so difficult.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking.
Yes,
and
it's heartbreaking.
I heard on the radio this morning, Malcolm I think it was Malcolm Nance.
That was an amazing show this morning.
Yes. I heard parts of it. Yes.
Yeah, his history of the area is amazing.
Yeah, just to go through how I did hear a little bit about how it's been, hundreds of years of the same cycle. And that made my heart hurt even more.
Yeah.
I've been rereading short stories by Rudyard Kipling. And and I don't know whether it's in a poem or in one of those stories, said nobody will ever win in Afghanistan. It's just, this was back in 1830 or something when the British couldn't do anything with it. The Russians tried, they couldn't do anything with it. I don't know, well, I do know why we got in there in the first place, but I think it's an unwinnable situation. I really feel for the women in particular, and anyone who helped the United States, and anyone who fought over there and was injured or their families in case they were killed. I just
because now families and individuals are left with that feeling of, there was no, my grief wasn't worth it.
Right.
So, and especially as we are talking about this very difficult biblical passage, to have the situation in Afghanistan as modern background information to this particular very vulnerable story of Tamar in her situation. It just,
and a very tribal story.
Very tribal story, yes. So it was one of these, back when I was doing this outline, I had no idea what was going to be coming down. I had no idea that this particular story would be timely with what's going on in Afghanistan. And anyway, it's well, let's come in with a moment of prayer and then get into the story. Almighty God, you sometimes put impossible situations before us, and we wonder, where are you in these times and in these stories? Help us to hear your hope in impossible and unwinnable situations. Help us to find your purpose, your grounding, and your kingdom when we are feeling overwhelmed. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, so I can't tell you how many people on Sunday had read ahead to the story. Yeah, Diane, you mentioned it, but you weren't the only one who approached me and said, the next Bible story is a bit difficult. I think that it was actually Harriet who said, I didn't even know that story was in the Bible.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Or some iteration of of that phrase, just,
Well, it's not one we ever taught in Sunday school, that's for sure.
That's right. That's right. And for obvious reasons. I mean, it's a traumatic story. But yeah, this Tamar's story, this Tamar is mentioned as one of the women in Matthew's genealogy. So her story is part of Jesus' story. And yet we know nothing about her in our regular conversation. I mean, it's a difficult story, so it stands to reason. But she's only mentioned in our regular worship services if we happen to actually go through Jesus' genealogy. But her story isn't in the lectionary, and it's a challenging story.
And in my commentary,
Yeah.
I mean, it says that it interrupts the story about Joseph, and that it's probably put in there just to set up, to show the line, which is interesting.
That's a very good point. I haven't yet come across that note in my commentaries, but that's because I haven't read through all my commentaries yet. In fact, the study guide questions that I sent over came from some of the paragraphs that I read in this, Preaching the Women of the Old Testament book. But then more recently, I came across other study questions and ideas in my other book, Interpretation Women in the Old Testament. So I might be bringing up some of those thought points in our discussion today. And then I, of course, have Harriet's commentary, because she always, she reads ahead. And so for worship on Sunday, I had put in the outline Genesis chapter 38, verses 2 through 26. And does anyone want to read part of it? Read through all of it? I'm willing to.
I'll read.
Okay, thank you, Arlene.
You want start with 2 or start with 1?
Why don't we start with 1?
At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. An interesting side note.
Yes.
Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute. for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adulamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where's the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said, "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah, which means scarlet or brightness, according to the note.
Thank you, Arlene.
The NIV Study Bible refers to this as an unsavory story.
Ah, yes. And it is in Jesus Genealogy.
Yep.
Yeah, it's really an incredible story of vulnerability. And it actually relates, it has, it ties in with Ruth's story that we read last week, even though in terms of the genealogy timing, Ruth's story takes place after Tamar's story. I decided when I was making up the outline to have Ruth's story first because it's a little bit more palatable and it introduces, this idea of a widow being given to, her dead husband's brother in order to have this child. So that's why I put these women out of order in terms of where they come in the genealogy, so that we'd have that introduction first before tackling Tamar's story. But yeah, this Women in the Bible book that I have says, multiple scholars compare Ruth the Moabite with Tamar the Canaanite, Canaanites being another group despised by Israel. Indeed, Tamar is one of the three women named in Ruth, chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. Both become widows and both become a crucial part of church history. Sorry, reading ahead here. Yes. Both Ruth and Tamar are dehumanized by the patriarchy, by food insecurity, the threat of violence, and by being invisible. They're dehumanized by the patriarchy, specifically the need for a male and the need to bear children in order to be more secure. Both Ruth and Tamar are husbandless and childless. Both stories reveal the flawed nature of Levirate marriage, especially since males could avoid it. Ruth had no access to other sons of Naomi, since Naomi had no other sons, and Judah refuses to give Tamar his third son, forcing her to take extreme risks to survive. And it continues in various things, but yeah, these stories are both about women facing impossible choices in impossible situations where they are extremely vulnerable. And as we've mentioned, while women around the world face these extremes of vulnerability, right now, so many of us are thinking so much about the women in Afghanistan right now who, my heart cries out for all the Tamars in Afghanistan right now. So what are some of your thoughts?
A couple of things I question, but they're one of those things we don't have answers for, and it really has to do with the men. It is why the second son did not impregnate her, because that was what you did. So it surprised me kind of that he did not do that. And the other one was, why did Judah not let his third son, was he afraid of losing him also? I mean, those are answers we will not have.
Well, that's what it said. He didn't want to. That's why he sent Tamar to live with her father, because he said maybe he would lose that son too. So he would wait till he grew up.
Yeah, in verse 11.
But then he did grow up, right? I mean,
right. But then he didn't act on it. So.
He didn't act on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Judah had that power.
Yeah.
Yeah. Judah had power of life or death over Tamar, despite the fact that she was living in her parents' house.
She was right.
Judah was still her head of household because of where she had married into. And the text says that that Onan, Onan knew the offspring would not be his, so whenever he would lie with Tamar, he would ejaculate on the ground to avoid begetting an offspring for his dead brother. And so you wonder, well, did he have a family of his own? Because sometimes in Ruth, when Boaz is talking with the male who's closer in line to helping Naomi out, that individual says, oh, if I act as Ruth's redeemer kin, that'll be less for my own family. I need to worry about my own family. So there's a part of me that wonders, is Onan thinking along those lines? Does he have his own family, and could that be why he's not honoring this particular culture, or is he just making his own choice to not participate in this part of the culture because it's not a responsibility that he wanted to be saddled with? You're right. We don't actually know Onan's reasoning.
And actually, he's pretty bold not doing that.
Yeah.
Between God and his father. Yeah. He's pretty bold not to, in my eyes, not to do that, because that was the norm.
Right. That was the culture.
Times. Yeah.
And it might, we read these stories and we think, if anyone today, if you've got a couple and one of them dies and the the person who is still alive then marries the sibling of their dead spouse, then there's scandal. Sometimes it works out and everything's fine, but oftentimes they'll face a lot of talk, because that's our culture.
That's our culture. Exactly.
Right. You don't necessarily do it. It can be done. I mean, there's nothing saying that you can't do it, but it's not so much our culture.
So we're not comfortable with it because it's not our culture.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That was the other reason why I thought, yes, this passage, it mentions, it mentions topics that, that we don't like to talk about, depending on your version, it'll say semen or ejaculation or all these other things that it's like, oh, we can't talk about, but it's in our Bible. It's good to occasionally just, and I loved, Arlene, how you read it. It was just like, yep, I'm reading the Bible, and these are the words that are on it, and I'm not making a big deal about it because it's just what it is. So I really appreciated how you read it, Arlene. But yeah, it's not, these stories are not familiar to our cultures, and they are foreign. And so it's sometimes difficult to actually understand the motivations and to understand what's going on. And we never will completely understand all of the motivations of what's going on because it's not familiar to our culture.
But for her, it was survival, like it was with Ruth. It's
Exactly.
survival.
Exactly. And so Tamar had to make extreme choices in order to have security, in order to be alive. Getting back to how Naomi felt, dead because she didn't have the security, Tamar was feeling, I imagine, pretty desperate. I mean, she made the choice to hide who she was, to put herself in an extremely vulnerable situation in order to maybe have a chance at security.
Now, what is the significance of the twins being born? And
so in the genealogy of Matthew, let's see here. I'm looking up. So Perez, who was originally going to be the second son,
right, he
but
became the first.
He broke through. He became the first son.
Is he in the lineage?
Exactly. That's what I was just looking up. Is Tamar and Judah begot Perez and Zerah. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram.
Okay.
So the son who was supposed to be the second son but became the first son because he broke out or pushed through or whatever. That's the one that's in Jesus Genealogy.
Okay.
Jesus Genealogy is a fascinating study of dysfunctional families. Or trickster situations. Because with Tamar, she had to take extreme measures. She had to take extreme risks. Let's see here. There was, okay. Ruth and Tamar, this is again from the Women in the Bible. Ruth and Tamar suffer both tragedy and structural injustices that leave male-less women vulnerable. Ruth and Tamar resist dehumanization only by cleverness and foresight. If Tamar had not thought ahead to get Judah's items, she would have been executed. They survive and outwit the system in order to gain a future, though each takes great risks to do so. Tamar dressing up and going to the city gate to engage Judah. Ruth dressing up and going to the threshing floor to engage Boaz. In doing so, these women employ a survival strategy of the oppressed. The genre of the trickster tale is a well-known strategy of resistance groups who find themselves in situations of oppression. In Genesis, we actually, the story of Jacob is very much that trickster story as well, if you remember. So it's a story of resistance It's a story of fighting back against oppressive powers. It's a story of standing up for your rights. It's not a story of pushing others out of the way, but a story of saying, I am worth having my own place. And so often, depending on, where we are in a particular culture, it's easy to identify with being on the dehumanized end of things, even if we are the oppressor. And that's sometimes what's also difficult about reading some of these stories, is we want to identify with lifting up those who are oppressed, or we want to say, or we want to condemn Tamar. She's gotten a really bad rap throughout history for being one of the bad girls of the Bible. She's a prostitute. She's one of the bad girls of the Bible.
But without her, you don't have the line for Jesus.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's tricky and it's complicated. Let's see. So this book goes on to say, it is only when Judah and Tamar meet in the public square, an exceedingly dangerous place for Tamar, who stands to lose her life any minute, that Judah finally recognizes Tamar's righteousness, and her righteousness inspires him to act in greater righteousness. Moreover, it is Tamar's foresight to ask for identification tokens that finally compels Judah to see Tamar's just cause when his eyes are opened to the evidence of his actions. It is when Judah truly looks that he recognizes Tamar's true worth as a woman in need who is more righteous than him, not a prostitute, but a daughter-in-law who ought to have been protected and provided for by her household and community. There seems to be a connection between really seeing the other and seeing that justice be done. So one of the criticisms that some commentators in the past have made about Tamar's actions is to say that, Tamar should have been more patient. She should have waited for Judah to get around to giving her Shelah as a husband. Of course, you do a little math and you figure, she would have been much, much older than Shelah. And she was probably thinking, I'm running out of time,
right,
to actually have security and to actually be able to live. But yeah, one of the criticisms that is often leveled at Tamar is that she acted out of turn.
But she also had no assurance that Judah would do what he was. I mean, he'd already
exactly
evaded his responsibility twice. So, well, Onan really was a little different situation. But anyway, she wouldn't have had any reason to trust him.
Exactly. You absolutely hit it, the nail on the head. Is that is precisely why, from Tamar's viewpoint, she couldn't wait. Her time to act was 2 minutes ago, because she was facing that long, dark tunnel of insecurity, of dehumanization, of death. And even if her father's household provided her sustenance, she wasn't really living the life that she was meant to live. That would only happen if she had this male child. And then she gets two. So this book now has various preaching heads, and it says, let's see here. John Calvin said that Tamar should have been patient and waited for God to bring her justice. In a similar way, during the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, African Americans were told that if they were patient, polite, and hardworking, eventually they would be given the right to cast a vote and eat at a lunch counter. In the meantime, they should wait. In response, Martin Luther King Jr. described the typical experience of African Americans, which included lynch mobs, hate-filled policemen, poverty, exclusion, and humiliation. He concluded, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a denigrating sense of nobody-ness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. Mm-hmm. Tamar and Martin Luther King Jr. had very difficult experiences, but they shared the sense that they could no longer wait for the people in power to grant them freedom. They did what they needed to do to seek justice. They were not selfish, but righteous.
Hmm. And I'm assuming she took a huge chance in what she did that he would recognize her.
Yeah.
Then I assume she would have been put to death.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, she was facing death no matter what.
No matter what.
So she had an impossible choice to make, because no matter what, she could die. And she nearly did.
Hmm.
So let's see what Harriet says. Actually, let me also bring up some of my study guide questions. Right, so the study guide questions that I sent over was, once we understand the culture of the story, what different choices could have been made by the characters for justice to have been administered earlier and consequently in less dramatic fashion? How do little choices for convenience coalesce into large unjust systems? I think I said, yeah. I think that those are the questions that I sent over.
Yes, they are. Yes.
Okay, good.
Well, Judah could have given her the third son.
Yep.
Earlier. That would have, taken care of a lot. I think.
And that third son would have been young enough not to have any other family, any other marriage. So,
but there again, you get back to, you wouldn't have the Jesus line.
That's right.
So it's really all set up for that.
Mm.
So in a way, there is no changing the story.
Right. Well, that's a good point. I also think that this is early on enough that had some of those changes happened, then perhaps Jesus' genealogy may have been different.
Would have been different.
Right. It could have been. Or perhaps Tamar would have had children within her marriage to Sheila. We don't know. So.
It's very much a patrilineal culture, because if there were daughters, it's not that there aren't women or daughters mentioned in the Bible, but the significant people are, and when someone gives birth, it's the males for the most part that are mentioned.
Yeah.
The daughters seem to be there to have sons.
Yeah. True. That's, well, and that was a big deal.
Yeah.
It still is in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And even in Western culture, I mean, if you go back to when there were monarchies, I mean, now they're constitutional monarchies, but it's just recently in Great Britain that they changed the succession to the throne,
Right.
to move girls up in the daughters up in the progression.
Yep.
Went all the boys first. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. How much different would world history have been if with King Henry, with King Henry VIII, who what is that? King Henry VIII had 6 wives. He had girl children before he finally got a boy child, and history could have been different, but it was so strongly patrilinear. And that's the culture that has, it's the culture that has dominated history and writing, even though we know intellectually that there have been other cultures in this world that have been very matriarchy based.
The Iroquois.
Exactly. Very strong matriarchy, very strong. Even to this day, it's still, from my understanding, it's still very strongly women honoring in the Iroquois culture. Although I think they're now, I think it's the Abenaki is the name that they're most often using. But yeah, our faith history has this very strong patrilinear line, and therefore very vulnerable women in it.
Now in the the study
Yes.
Bible,
Yes.
one of the things it says in the beginning, talking about the story, and it just says Joseph's play is interrupted by a story about Judah and his family, in which themes of knowledge, deception, and recognition continue to reverberate. Judah's previous duplicity toward his brother and father are repaid by his daughter-in-law Tamar's deception of him. So I don't know the story of Judah before that.
That's a good question.
What did he do?
One of the brothers who sold Joseph into slavery.
Oh,
Yes,
okay,
yeah.
thank you. Okay, so it's kind of like
What goes around comes
here,
around.
Judah.
Yeah, let's see here. That's Jacob.
So that's the story before then, is it, about Joseph? Yeah, sold and taken to Egypt. Okay.
Yeah.
I got to learn to read before.
In the middle and then after, yes. Yeah.
Because they're always connected somehow.
Yep. Yeah. Right before in 37, it's about Joseph. And yes, so chapter 37 is Joseph had a dream, and in it he told his brothers, and when he told his brothers, they hated Joseph all the more. And it goes on. Yeah, so it's when Joseph came upon his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornamented robe he wore, and picked him up and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty and there was no water in it. When the brothers sat down to eat, they noticed a caravan coming to Gilead. Judah said to the others, "What is to be gained by murdering Joseph and concealing his death? Why not sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites? He is, after all, our flesh and blood, and in that way, his blood would not be on our hands." The others agreed. So yeah, Judah's a real wonderful person now, isn't he?
But he was kind of the good guy, because otherwise Joseph would have been killed.
That's true.
I mean, he did save Joseph's life by, I mean, not that he should have gone with along with the whole thing in the beginning, but the other brothers were ready to either, well, they just were going to leave him in the pit or whatever.
But then they still tricked their dad into thinking that
Right.
that Joseph had been murdered.
So that's kind of the connection, because then Tamar tricks him.
Yep.
So that in a way is a little bit of a connection,
Yep.
rather than just saying that story's in there,
Yeah.
for no reason.
There's always a reason.
There's always a reason,
Always a
right?
reason. Yeah. So yes, it comes back around to highlighting that trickster nature.
Mm-hmm.
We saw it with Jacob, saw it with Judah, saw it with Tamar, and so that goes to show that sometimes that trickster nature is used in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's used to gain advantage. Sometimes it's used to redress justice, and it goes back and forth. Because you could also say that that when Tamar was giving birth to her twins, you again have this trickster reversal of fortune thing with the one twin's hand coming out. That twin's going to be the first one. Nope, it's not. It's this other one who broke through. Twins, they keep on happening in the Bible because you've got Esau and Jacob. Yes, I think yes. And the one chasing the other and grabbing onto the heel. And so it's easy to see how you can have ingrained in our faith this dualism, one or the other, back and forth. When in reality, it's not really one versus the other. It's how are we all in this together? How do we each affect each other? And how can we build each other up? So one of the things in Tamar's story is about the little choices that are made. So Judah moves to Canaan and gets a Canaanite wife, and in the version that I'm reading, the wife's name was Shua. As Arlene read, it was Shua was the father of the Canaanite woman. So clearly there's some ambiguity about naming, but that's not really the important part. The important part is Judah decided to go to Canaan, which again was another one of the enemies of Israel. Gets a Canaanite wife himself and chooses a Canaanite wife for his oldest son. My verse 7 reads, however, Judah's firstborn was corrupt in Yahweh's sight. So Yahweh caused Er's death. Arlene, I think that what you read was that did what was evil or did what was wicked or something like that. So choices that made, we don't know what they are. But clearly the text is saying that God blamed for his own choices, which is a problematic theology, but it's what was thought at the time. Onan makes choices. Well, first of all, Judah, orders Onan to fulfill this obligation. And so perhaps Judah handled it poorly. We don't know. But still, Judah and Onan both had the power in that situation, and Tamar did not. She wasn't ever asked if this is what she wanted. Clearly, it was a somewhat familiar culture because she went along with it. We don't know how willing she was to go along with it, but that's what she did. Onan made choices in deciding to ejaculate outside, to ensure that there wasn't a pregnancy. And so again, that comes back to, he's making this choice, and then you see that same language of God saying, no, I don't like what choices you've made, so I'm going to kill you. And again, that's very problematic theology, but it's what was familiar. It's how it was written. So yeah, there's so many little choices along the way that all come together in this story.
One of the notes in the NIV Study Bible is that it points out in the very beginning of the chapter that God separated people were among the Canaanites. I mean, that was Judah's choice. He had left the rest of the family and gone to Canaan. And in Egypt, the Israelites were separated from the Egyptian culture, as far as everyday life went. I mean, yeah, they wound up working as slaves, but they were still a separate identity. And so they developed into a nation without losing their identity, whereas Judah was among the Canaanites and was influenced by their culture. Just kind of an interesting note.
Yeah, so again, choices.
Yeah, Judah was he made a choice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine the anxiety of young girls in that culture. Am I going to marry? Am I going to have a son?
Yeah.
That's interesting, because that seemed to be their whole acknowledging them as if they had a son so that's interesting too.
Yeah, their entire identity, purpose for existence was wrapped up in whether or not they could produce a male child for their tribal chief. Or for their head of household, for their husband, but their entire identity and purpose was to be a broodmare.
Yeah. And still in our culture, certainly being a person who didn't have children, you're looked upon kind of like, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you have children or whatever, which I find interesting. But also, on the other hand, any woman could have a child that wants to, and does not have to be married, does not, can do in vitro, whatever. So it's an interesting, there's two sides to that one. Yeah.
There absolutely are. Yeah, there's definitely we still have this association, even in our culture, of, worth through children or lack thereof. And while certainly in my generation, there's more of a push for to break some of that stigma, it's still a fight. Still a fight. Because people question.
And I know sometimes there'll be some little thing and I'll say to Richard, who made this one up? Who decided this was going to be what we had to do in our culture? And that's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
Is people got together and decided something, and then you all go along with it because you don't want to be out of the culture. You don't, so that's interesting. So these women really took a risk.
They did.
They really went outside of what culture expected of them.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, they took a risk, but they felt they had no other choice.
Right.
Felt that it was the only way that they could have security was to take this risk. And what if what if we were able to ensure a society where no one had to take these risks?
Right.
What would that look like?
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Is there a
Yeah.
way to get to that point? Is there a way to get to the point of saying no one has to take the risks that Tamar and Ruth had to in order to find security?
Mm.
But I don't know where I was reading it the other day. I read some, it may have been in a newspaper, but it was about human trafficking, and had a couple of stories about young girls who were just, in Asia or somewhere in utter poverty, and they took a job seemingly as a housekeeper or a restaurant worker or something, and then turned out they were basically sold into prostitution or forced into prostitution, and then really stuck there. So it's that's this. I mean, they make a choice to leave their home because there's nothing for them there, and then go somewhere else, and they have no choice about what happens to them.
Yeah. That's a very good point, because essentially that's similar to what Tamar did. She left her parents' house and she took a risk, and she actually had to traffic herself, specifically with her father-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not quite the same situation as the women who are tricked into human trafficking, but it still comes around to that risk of, how can I secure myself? How can I, how can I provide for myself? And someone who's answering an ad for a job doesn't anticipate being kidnapped and sold into slavery.
Interesting too that Tamara, she's sitting by the side of the road, which was, I guess, a normal place for a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
But did she hide in the bushes, if there were any bushes, till Judah came along? I mean, it doesn't say anything about her being approached by any other men or anything.
Right.
She knew Judah was on his way because she had somehow heard it, but.
Yeah, I thought of that too, because that was taking that risk that
Exactly.
she's going to be with Judah. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure if someone else came along, she couldn't say no. That
Right.
wouldn't have been an option. So,
Right. Because if she tried to say no to someone else, what could have happened?
Exactly. She'd probably be killed, I would
Right.
assume. Yeah.
Raped at the very least.
At the very
Killed
least.
at the
Yeah.
very worst.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't know which is worst or least, but
Yeah.
yeah. So maybe it's killed at the very least, raped at the very worst.
Right.
But yeah, she took a major risk in order to secure her future. It's definitely a troubling story. It's definitely one that, it's not really, safe for children to learn about, except what if we did teach them about how to respect your own self, how to make choices, how to avoid risky situations, and when it is appropriate to take risks. These are tough lessons.
Or also how to make a society or culture where you do not have to make those terrible decisions. Like you said, no one should have to be making some of the decisions that people have to make.
Yeah. When people are fleeing their homeland because it's not safe.
I think of that one all the time. Yeah.
Why do people need to flee their homelands? Is it food insecurity, which is terrible enough? Is it violence? Is it what is it? And so instead of having these debates over whether or not we should provide aid to people, or open our borders or whatever, shouldn't we actually be talking about what are the root causes?
Right. Why are they doing this? Yeah.
Right. Of whatever nature.
Yeah.
And what can we do to help, redress the balance of insecurity and injustice?
But that's kind of what we were trying to do in Afghanistan, was change the culture and
Change the culture. Yeah.
Right. That brings it back around to understanding cultures.
Yeah, you can't change the culture. That's, yeah. But I can't imagine like the immigrants, like someone that their situation is so bad that they are willing to take on what it takes to try and get to this country.
Yeah.
When you think, and with knowing they may die on the way.
Yep.
So how bad is their situation, which I don't think I could even probably imagine, being in the culture I'm in and lifestyle I'm in, but I try to think about that. What could their lifestyle be like that they take that? That's such a huge risk, and with your children.
Yep.
Yeah.
But that's the risk that Tamar took.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, we are coming up on the end of our hour.
Okay.
I've taken some notes. I've appreciated this conversation. It's been very deep. It's touched on a lot of grounds. It's looked at a story that is very difficult. Oh, right. I was going to bring up Harriet's notes. Right. So she talks about the power switched back and forth, but in the end, Tamar showed her power. Perez became head of the clan and ancestor of David and therefore of Jesus. This is a story of justice in ancient times, as this is the way things were handled. Not that I would have wanted, or any other woman in those times. We would all like to help, or we would all like help from our family members, but not gain protection the way these women had to do in some cases. Many different small choices could have changed the story. Maybe the mistakes that Judah's sons made could have been corrected and the Lord would not have put them to death. We do not know what they did, so ... Many small things became large and ended in producing a very dramatic and story that is not forgotten once read. Yeah. So we'll close in prayer. Or any other final thoughts, final notes? Thanks for sticking with me through this story.
I look forward to hearing the sermon on Sunday.
I look forward to writing it. I look forward to hearing it too.
Okay.
Let us pray. Almighty God, our heart cries out to you for the injustice that your people suffer in so many different ways. We read these ancient stories that are difficult to read because the culture is incomprehensible, but we try to understand. And then we look around and we see that even today, oh God, there are cultures that we have no comprehension of. We stick our feet in, intending to help, intending to bring your justice. And we don't know, sometimes we have stirred up the hornet's nest worse than ever. Help us to realize that your peacemaking efforts are always worthwhile, and we should always be open to how you are calling us to be your peacemakers in the world. Let us listen, let us understand, and help us to act, because the time is now to bring your justice to the world. Let us know how to bring your justice to the world. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.